If you're anything like me, then you go back to older titles excited to see how they're gonna play on your modern PC, only to then be disappointed by crashing, bugs, and way too many options to choose from due to emulation opening the doors to most console ports. Well, I'm here to hopefully do all the hard work for you, comparing and tinkering in order to find the most definitive way to play this game. I want to keep the original developer's vision whilst renewing it to the modern era. And with the Max Payne remakes being well on their way or already out depending on when you're watching this video, I thought it'd be an amazing opportunity to play the originals first before you experience the remakes. Since the series was built for PC first and then later ported to consoles, the console ports are often way too inferior in terms of fidelity, loading times and cut content. Therefore, we are going to be focusing on the PC version of the game for this video. There is still a ton of fixes necessary to get these older games working perfectly on modern machines, as well as loads of interesting tweaks and mods to enhance your first or returning playthrough. So join me as we dive into the Max Payne rabbit hole and answer that fabled question that we often ask on the series. What is the best way to play the Max Payne games? If you don't have your hands on a copy of Max Payne yet, then you can do so with today's sponsor, Instant Gaming. Instant Gaming has all of the Max Payne games separately for under £5, as well as the bundle where you can get 1 and 2 for under £10. All of the games they sell on here come directly from their official suppliers, meaning that you don't have to worry about a dodgy game key. Also, in my experience, every game that I've bought has been delivered super fast, meaning that you can get to playing your games within literal seconds. You can get a whole host of games, old and new, here for prices lower than on Steam, and for every purchase that you make here using my link, you will not only save yourself some money on great games, but be actively supporting what we do here on Retro Renew. So if you're interested, use the link in the description and get yourself a great deal.
The American dream come true. Honey, I'm home. But dreams have a nasty habit of going bad when you're not looking.
The first Max Payne was developed by Remedy Entertainment. It was released in July of 2001 with the Xbox and PlayStation 2 versions getting ports later in the year in December. This game got widespread attention during its release for its innovative gameplay and unique neo-noir narrative style. The game introduced a feature that became a massive trend in first and third person shooter games known as bullet time. This mechanic allowed players to slow down time during combat, drawing heavy inspiration from Hong Kong action cinema, as well as of course the popularized film The Matrix. The game's storytelling was delivered through graphic novel style panels, with a narration by Max himself portrayed by the late James McCaffrey. The game solidified itself in gaming history and propelled the studio to legendary status. Before we dive into the PC version of the game, let's take a quick glance at the console versions to see just how different they are. So out of all the 3 versions, the Xbox version does actually come pretty close to the PC one, and we can play this through the Xemu emulator. Whenever I have to use this emulator, there's always something that goes wrong with it that I have to troubleshoot, and I think that's just down to how underdeveloped it is compared to the other ones. Once I did have it set up though, it worked pretty well. There were a few things that bugged me though. Firstly, I couldn't get the widescreen support working, so I had to play in 4:3, and also things like the iconic graphic novels didn't actually work at all. There is apparently a fix to this though, where you use an earlier version of Xemu, and also potentially, depending on when you're watching this video, there may be a new version out that fixes this. The PS2 version running on the PCSX2 emulator has a widescreen patch, but it gets even more downgrades like removed areas, downgraded overall graphics, and way more loading screens. The performance was pretty bad for me as well. So with a short glimpse of the console versions out the way, let's now hone in on the PC version and see what we can do to it. There is so much going on with this PC version that we need to fix, and there are 2 ways of going about it. The first is the tedious manual way, which could take you anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. Or there's option 2, which is what I'm going to suggest in this video, and that's to use a complete FixPack. The complete FixPack essentially has the purpose of correcting many of the known issues with the game in such a simple, user-friendly way in the form of an installer. And this installer has tons of options, so let's go through each of them, compare them all, and see which ones we prefer. Firstly, let's take a look at the fan-made high-resolution texture pack. They are scaled using some AI techniques, with some being handmade. 95% of the textures have been replaced, and they look pretty great. Obviously, you need to set expectations with this kind of stuff, as things like signs and text tend to be not perfect. For me though, especially in these fast-paced shooter games, I don't really stop and stare at the textures too much, so this added little bit of fidelity goes a long way for me personally. What I did notice, however, which was a big downside for me, was how long the loading times are with these. Even running on a 3080 with 10GB of VRAM, I still saw loading times from 30 seconds to a minute. This was in comparison to the maybe 5-10 seconds that they were in the vanilla game. The second option will apply a startup fix. The reason this is needed is because machines nowadays are obviously a lot faster than the ones during the game's release in 2001. What it would cause is the game to just not start up at all. It also allows us to add a DirectX wrapper, which can take the ancient DX8 rendering API to a much newer DX11 version. This is important not just because it's outdated, but because Windows 10 and up tend to completely ignore settings within DX8. To be honest, in my testing it was better to have the latest version installed, so I went with the DX11 approach. Sound is super buggy in this game as well, with most notably issues with the sound cutting out or being too low volume. So the sound fixes here should fix most, if not all, of the sound issues. The author states that you should see these three options as the first one being the best one, and then the second and third being backups if they don't work. The rest of the options have nothing really to compare here, and they add things like the widescreen fix as well as an AMD CPU fix that, to be honest, you can just leave all checked. I also checked the DG Voodoo control panel within the game's directory to make sure that it was using the max amount of VRAM since we're using high-res texture packs, and also to disable the watermark. There's also some more errors with the game, like a JPG error that I got conflicting information whether this was included in the FixPack or not, so I just added it anyway to be safe. Also, there's two difficulty fixes. There's one that allows you to select the difficulty, which normally you can't do unless you've beaten the game. This is beneficial because returning players can now pick the harder difficulties, and newer players can choose the easiest option, although the easiest option is, I'm pretty sure, the default setting. The easiest difficulty can actually be quite difficult though, because it implements the adaptive difficulty system within the game, which is actually broken by default. How it's supposed to work is that it tracks the frequency of players' deaths. If they die too many times, then it will reduce the difficulty. However, if you don't die, it will lead to the difficulty being increased. It's broken because it doesn't account for player deaths properly, making the difficulty very quickly scale to the hardest values, making certain scenarios more difficult than they should be. So downloading this second difficulty fix will fix that adaptive difficulty problem. With all the fixes out of the way, let's get this game looking as best as we can. These are the settings that the author of the FixPack recommended, so I went with them. Since this game is so old, the anti-aliasing that's built into it is pretty poor. Here is what the default anti-aliasing looks like both off and at the 8x setting. As you can see, the 8x setting does do a decent job at getting rid of the jagged edges, but there are still points that can be improved, like on the left side of Max's head here. That's where something like ReShade comes in, where you can either add immersive SMAA or just SMAA. Both of these are pretty similar, and both of them do a really good job at getting rid of pretty much all the jagged edges, making the edges super smooth. There is also the option of adding it through the DG Voodoo control panel, but I think this comes pretty close to the default option, so I don't think it's that beneficial to use. Besides the launcher though, in-game there isn't really any settings that we can change, other than making sure the brightness is set correctly and the texture sharpness is set to the max. Also, it's a good idea to set anisotropic filtering to 16 times on a driver level in order to get super crisp textures even when looking far away. As you can see in this scenario, with it off, the subway floor gets a little bit blurry as it gets further away from the camera, whereas that does not happen with anisotropic filtering on. Modern gaming has pretty much switched entirely to borderless gaming instead of the old exclusive full screen, so if you want that luxury of playing in borderless windowed mode, the widescreen fix actually allows that via putting an INI file within the game directory. Also, if you want to add some really subtle but nice global illumination to your game via ReShade, then my ReShade preset will be in the description. This is an extremely lightweight preset. Besides sharpening the game a tiny bit and adding anti-aliasing, it also adds global illumination via the Nice Guy shader. And as you can see here, it's really subtle, but it adds really nice glow to things like the subway lights. My aim for this is making a super subtle preset that basically just lifts the game ever so slightly whilst keeping that original look. Now, besides visuals, there is one technical thing that is really important for this game, and that's capping the FPS to 60. By default, what the FixPack does is set VSync to on, which then caps the frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate. So if you're on a 60Hz monitor, then there's not really much you need to do. But on a 240Hz monitor like myself, it's going to cap the FPS way too high, and there's going to be issues like the infamous shoot dodge bug. Now this game is completable at 120 FPS, I did so a couple months back, but you are going to encounter the shoot dodge bug and also some other animation issues, so if you want the perfect experience, you need to go with 60 FPS here. Lastly, there is one small quirk that you might notice when you start to play the game with this FixPack, and that's that the video player buttons during the comic book sections are gone. Now this is done on purpose because they are bugged anyway. You can however still use the controls. Here's a screen cap of how you can navigate the comic panels. If you want them back, you can just click F2, but the only thing is, due to the scaling issues, you're going to have to find on the screen where the button is actually clickable, as they're not going to be where they display on your screen. Besides that though, I've played through the entire game with these tweaks before, and have encountered exactly 0 crashes, bugs, or low frame rate. After all of this, you'll now have the most definitive way to play the first Max Payne. I still think there is a place for the console versions if you have any particular nostalgia for them, but if you're a new player, I think the PC is the only option that you should go with. So the answer to the question what is the best way to play is definitely the PC version with all of the tweaks that I covered in this video. And now that we've fully explored Max Payne 1 and all of its quirks, fixes and tweaks, let's move on to Max Payne 2.
I lied to myself that it was over. It wasn't over. And it would get worse before the end.
The second game in the Max Payne series was released 2 years later in 2003. Due to the massive success of the first game, Take-Two Interactive acquired the franchise from Remedy and 3D Realms shortly after in 2001. They then announced plans to make this sequel. Sam Lake, who wrote the first game, also returned to write this one, and whilst critics thought that the narrative was engaging as well as the gameplay being more refined, the game actually experienced lower than expected sales. Despite sales though, people tend to look back on this game quite fondly today, which is why I still think it's worth playing. Especially if you like the first one, because it is just more Max Payne. Again, like the previous Max Payne game, the console versions are definitely inferior, as you can see on screen here with the comparison of the PC to the PS2 version. Here's a closer look at the PS2 version running on the PCSX2 emulator, and as you can see, the overall presentation here just isn't as clean as the PC version. And because we can mod and tweak the PC version like we're gonna do in this video, that's gonna make it the most definitive experience you could ever hope for. We're going to be using the Steam release of the version for this video, not the DVD version. The Steam version is the most up-to-date version of the game, and it's also so easily accessible. So the essential tweaks that we need are the widescreen patch to get proper widescreen support, a D3-D9 wrapper to help with stability, and some smaller fixes to smooth out some crashing issues and prevent bugs. Instead of the tedious task of going through all of these fixes one by one though, what I'm going to suggest that you do is grab the Max Payne Anthology Definitive Fixes. This is essentially a fix pack like we explored in the first game. This one actually includes all of the fixes for the first and second game, but we're of course only going to be focusing on the second game fixes here. Disabling anti-aliasing and replacing it with something else is also a good idea for this game. What the default anti-aliasing solution in this game does is create some bugs like the application load error one, and also it can cause your mouse movement to stutter. Having to turn off the in-game anti-aliasing doesn't mean we have to go without it either though, because we can use something like the NVIDIA Profile Inspector in order to add it back. Like here you can see on the left by default with it off, and then on the right with a 4x MSA-A setting enabled. Alongside disabling anti-aliasing, it's also very important that this game runs at a 60 FPS, otherwise there's going to be some small issues that occur. Capping the game was pretty easy, but I had to use Riva Tuner instead of the NVIDIA control panel, as for this game the NVIDIA control panel just did not work at all. The reason capping the FPS to 60 is important is because like many older games, they start to act strange when you reach to the 120 mark. Now old me actually played Max Payne 1 and 2 with a cap of 120 and didn't really notice any issues. But me personally not noticing them doesn't mean that there aren't any issues. Like we explored in Max Payne 1, there are very similar issues where stuff like the shoot dodge bug occurs. So when you dive as Max Payne, you will clip through the floor if you're at high frame rates, and that can cause you not to gain as much altitude as you're supposed to. This didn't affect my gameplay, so I either just shrugged it off as something that was supposed to be happening, or a little bug that I didn't really care that much for. So my advice here is to set it to 60 to make sure you're getting that original experience. There are also other bugs besides this one with high FPS, like physics objects being weird, dead bodies will jump up more, and NPCs may be knocked down by doors when opening them during scripted animations. These are all issues that the community have flagged when they tried it, so again, lock it to 60 and just be safe. We also can improve the anisotropic filtering of the game by setting it to 16 times within the NVIDIA control panel. What this does is just remove any potential blurriness as the textures get further away from the camera. Another thing worth noting is that you can tweak the FOV in the game now thanks to the widescreen fix that we installed. Do bear in mind that changing this can cause some graphical glitches. I did a playthrough with the first and second game with all of these fixes and had a blast, and if you've never played this game before, then I highly recommend you give it a shot with all of these fixes and extra tweaks installed. And with that, let's move on to covering Max Payne 3.
This poor bastard like some dime store angel of death. And I realized they were correct. I wouldn't know right from wrong if one of them was helping the poor and the other was banging my sister.
The series took a pretty long hiatus after the second game, when finally, in 2012, Max Payne 3 released. It marked a significant evolution in the series, but also a departure from its usual neo-noir tone. That's because Rockstar Studios took the helm for making this third game, and the development of the game was pretty rough with huge delays. It was initially announced in 2009 with a release window later that year, but due to internal development challenges, the game was pushed back further and further. When it did finally launch though, critics were pretty positive. The refined mechanics, gripping storyline, and high production values made for a really fun time. The game, similar to the second entry in the series, underperformed commercially. I always see Max Payne 3 as a bit of a nail in the coffin for the series, as the franchise has pretty much been left dormant ever since. In my opinion, the game is actually pretty amazing though, and it didn't deserve to underperform as much as it did. For example, the Max Payne shooting mechanics work so well in Rockstar's proprietary Rage engine. Adding that infamous Euphoria ragdolls from games like GTA 4 into the bullet time and shoot dodges of Max Payne was a match made in heaven. To get this game into the modern era doesn't take as much effort as the older titles, however, it's not perfect. For example, the game constantly crashed for me at first. I had to install a mod called FusionFix, which some of you may know from GTA 4. This just helps with overall stability, as well as adds minor features like the ability to switch on borderless windowed mode within the settings. A note to everyone on a dual monitor setup for these display modes, they don't lock your cursor to the game. That means that your cursor will go over to the second monitor and alt-tab you out of the game like it did for me. A program called Dual Monitor Tools allows you to lock the cursor to your main window, which was my janky workaround that I stuck with. I just set it to a hotkey and pressed it whenever I played. Like all the games so far, you need to cap this one to 60 as well. The camera can sometimes break during a shoot dodge according to the PC Gaming Wiki, but I couldn't however replicate it. If you see it in my footage though, then just know that it wasn't capped to 60 at that point. If you want to keep the game bug-free and set it to 60, but you also would like those higher frame rates because you're on something like a high refresh rate monitor, then using a program like lossless scaling to take it from 60 to 120 looks pretty great for most people, myself included. Capping to 60 and the FusionFix are the only technical things that you need to do to get this game functioning. So let's move on to exploring what options and mods this game has, and which ones are the most ideal for the best experience. In terms of graphic settings, this game has a lot of them, but since it's an older title, you can just pretty much crank everything to the highest it can go. The only one I think is worth looking closer at is the strangely buggy anti-aliasing. Performance with the MSAA setting weirdly has quite a big impact on the 1% lows in my testing, which is way too much of an impact for just anti-aliasing. The other method that you can enable within the game, FXAA, does not have this performance hit, and even using something like ReShade's MSAA shader in performance mode gives you better performance than the built-in MSAA, pretty close to FXAA as well. And taking a look at the visual comparisons between them, the built-in MSAA looks roughly the same, if not a tiny bit inferior, compared to the ReShade one. So I'd say it's best to go with that one since the built-in MSAA is clearly not optimized well. If you don't want to bother with ReShade though, I think FXAA is definitely a nicer balance between visuals and performance over the built-in MSAA. The texture packs that I found for this game were either too unfaithful for my liking or didn't do much at all. Here is the one that's showcased on the PC Gaming Wiki, and you can see in these side by sides there's really no change at all. In a different scene here, again, even zooming into 300%, I still cannot tell any texture difference between his shirt or the wall behind him. For this scene, however, whilst most textures look identical, the wood on the bar chairs does change to a higher quality texture, but it's a completely different texture that is not the same colour as the original. I was just looking for something that was similar to the Max Payne 1 texture pack, where it lifts the original textures ever so slightly rather than replacing them, so I don't think this texture pack is all that worth it. Something that is a very nice addition I'd recommend though is Xbox rain droplets. Now I'm pretty sure that this isn't in the Xbox 360 version of the game, as any footage online doesn't showcase them, but do let me know if I'm wrong here in the comments. I noticed that in the rain sections of the game, the puddles have little rain droplet splash effects, but there's no actual rain coming down, so I do think that this mod adds a bit more immersion to the game, making it feel like it's actually raining. But I do also understand if some of you look at this and just think it's a cheap effect and you don't really like it, so it's personal preference. And that about wraps it up for Max Payne 3. Like I said, not really a lot can be done here, but the things that you can do go a long way. Like FusionFix, capping to 60, and changing the anti-aliasing all make the game look so much better than the original. Especially since if you just download the game and do nothing about it, you're probably going to end up like me, where it was pretty much crashing upon every startup. Whether you've watched this video all the way through and had a look at how you can play every single Max Payne game on modern hardware, or you just picked one that you'd like to replay or play for the first time and went through that, I appreciate you all so much for watching. If I helped you in any way, or you just found this video entertaining, this is exactly the kind of retro game content that I provide here on the channel, so maybe consider subscribing and also enabling notifications to stay up to date with uploads. I'm going to start streaming every Wednesday on here and also YouTube, so enable notifications on either of those platforms to see when I'm live. Huge thanks to all the Patreon and YouTube members. You help tremendously at keeping this channel alive. If you'd like to do the same, you can do so for as low as £1 a month here on YouTube or Patreon. Both the links will be in the description, as well as the join button below. Both offer the same perks, so it's just up to you which platform you prefer. Now if you want to watch more content like this, then the Grand Theft Auto Best Way to Play series that I did quite a while back now is on the left. Or if you want to watch something with a little bit of a different format, then click on the right video where I remember the old Monster Hunter games by going back and killing the first monster from every generation. See you over there.